wanted to spend a little bit of time talking with you about two different studies that I've conducted on student parents. So to give you a sense, unlike most countries in Europe, the United States offers no comprehensive national support for parents and caregivers, including any paid leave for new parents. The best that we have was introduced under the presidency of Bill Clinton, and it's called the Family and Medical Leave Act, and it provides up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave and job protection for new parents. But you can see that there are a lot of stipulations that somebody has to work for a company or an organization with 50 or more people, and they have to have been with that company for over a year. The good news is for university staff that they are usually eligible as long as they've been there long enough. The United States also is very divided and benefits differ by states. And so you can see that there are some states that provide paid family leave. The 9 states are listed there, plus Washington, D.C., the country's capital. They offer some sort of paid and family and medical leave, where you can get a percentage of your weekly salary reimbursed, but it does not usually cover the whole week of absence. But, and this is critical to what I'm talking about today, student parents, if they're full-time students and they're not working for an organization, generally you're not going to be eligible for any sort of paid leave because they are not paying into the system, right? That in the United States, we're very much about everybody needs to contribute and pay taxes in order to get the benefit. So this is sort of setting up the dire stage for what national benefits look like. Further dire is the cost of childcare in the United States. And you can see in this map that it differs again by state. And what you're seeing here is the cost for full-time infant care per year. So California over on the West Coast, it's about $17,000. You can see Massachusetts is the dark blue, and it costs almost $21,000 to put your child in childcare. If you look down in the south of the United States, things tend to be a little cheaper. In Alabama and Mississippi, you see it's about $5,500 and $6,000. And even though that sounds cheaper than the $21,000 people in Massachusetts are paying, I want to remind everybody here that student parents are typically living at the poverty line. And so even that cost of money may be out of reach. So you see, it's a bit depressing already what caregiving looks like and support for caregivers looks like in the U.S. So with that context in mind, I want to provide a little more background just on student parents in the United States. So approximately 3 million undergraduate students studying in the United States are caregivers and are parents in particular. We typically say it's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 undergraduates. About 1 in 3 graduate students is a student parent, but I'm focusing today on undergraduates. And we can always think a little bit about that they're navigating multiple roles, right? That people are usually not students first. They're usually parents first. Often they're employees. They might be engaging in elder care or other care roles. And then they are a student on top of that. Nearly 3 in 5 students' parents work full-time while they're at university. And despite juggling all these roles, the literature takes a deficit perspective about student parents. So we talk a little bit about that they have lower degree completion rates. That you can see there that 28% of single student mothers versus 60% of non-parenting women will finish a 4-year degree, a university degree in 6 years. They're also 2 times as likely to be financially needy. 2 out of 3 live at or near the poverty line. And 62 out of 3 are also eligible for our federal Pell Grant, which provides around $6,000 of grant aid for the university. As anyone here who is a parent can attest, being a parent takes a lot of time. And so we often talk about time poverty, that student mothers typically have 105 fewer hours per semester to devote to their schoolwork than their non-parenting students. But despite all of these problems, I want to remind everybody about student mother achievement. Carly, my doctoral student who's joined in on this call, is one of these fantastically high achieving student mothers, right? Student parents earn higher GPAs than their non-parenting peers. In the United States, we have a GPA out of 4.0, and 1 out of 3 students have a 3.5 or above. And they're motivated. I'm not talking about it in this presentation today, but in another paper out of this data, student mothers talk a lot. We've learned from student mothers that they're coming to university to better their lives. They're trying to get a more financially secure position, a better, more interesting job, and to serve as motivation for their children. So this sort of sets the complex scene for what I want to share with you today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 studies, 2 different studies of student mothers. The first focuses on the impact of organizational culture on student mothers' experiences. And I'll provide you with more detail when I talk about each of those studies. But the first is a study of 6 higher education institutions in one state. And we interviewed both student mothers and academic and administrative staff on those campuses. I conducted that study with my co-PI, Dr. Alyssa Stephanie-Yates, and with the assistance of 2 really spectacular doctoral students, Kara Monaco and Alexandra Electronica Erb. The second study, funded by the Spencer Foundation, focuses on the impact of federal and state policy on student mothers' experiences. It was a longitudinal study of 57 student mothers in a variety of institutions across the U.S. And this study was greatly enhanced by help with a former doctoral student, now Dr. Danielle Lewis, and assistance from another doctoral student, Christina Collier. So I always want to acknowledge the labor that allows the work to be performed. To give you a sense about the literature on student parents, what is typically important, and this literature will carry through both projects, is institutional resources. There are some universities in the United States that provide a lot of support for student parents. And there are some that basically say good luck. You know, when we think about the very elite institutions, Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and I would imagine sort of Oxford here, there's really no acknowledgement that a student should have children. But then there are institutions that actually have robust student parent support programs. So this might look like having a dedicated staff member who helps a student navigate parenting and childcare and financial concerns. What's been most critical on many campuses is the provision of on-campus childcare. But the problem is it varies in its degree of accessibility to students. At the University of Buffalo, where I work, there is a very limited discount for student parents. It's perhaps 5% out of this overall $12,000 to $15,000 cost. Some community colleges, in contrast, offer free childcare. And for those who are not familiar, community colleges in the US are 2-year institutions where students will do some coursework to either enter a profession or to transfer to a 4-year university. But the problem is that childcare is expensive, not just for somebody to enroll their child, but for universities to operate. So many campuses are now closing their childcare centers, which leaves student parents in real trouble. But there are national and federal programs that provide subsidized childcare. The federal program, which we call C-Campus, which stands for Childcare Means Parents in School, is a grant-funded program that a university can get for 5 years. And it allows usually what institutions use the money for is to give free or very, very cheap childcare to student parents. The downside is that you're only in luck if you're going to that particular university or college. So there are some states like Minnesota that now offer subsidized childcare to student parents at colleges and universities across the state. And what I really hope is critical to take away is that the access to childcare makes a difference about keeping students enrolled. And it's what we heard over and over again in both of these studies. Other sources of support that are important to think about are the role of faculty and staff in supporting student parents. And I'll come back to this in particular in the second study. Families play a critical role. In a study I did with my colleague, Alyssa Stephanie-Yates, during COVID, typically it was mothers the mothers of the mothers we interviewed and their sisters and their grandmothers and their aunties who helped them navigate childcare issues when universities shut down and left them without any support. In the US, we also have a variety of government-funded programs. They're usually food assistance programs called SNAP and WIC, which you can see here. And then also housing subsidies and utility subsidies. And I'm not talking about it today, but Danielle, Dr. Lewis, and I have another paper that's currently under review in which we are talking a bit about how the availability and the ease of accessing government assistance varies for students depending on what states they live in. So states like California tend to be very liberal. They're run by Democrats. And so they have very liberal policies that support student mothers. Whereas there are some more conservative states like Texas and Florida and Georgia, and which don't provide much support for student parents. So despite the United States having uniform policy like SNAP and WIC, where you live makes a difference in how you navigate accessing them, and that's your experiences at university. So for this particular study that I'm going to first share with you, as a reminder, this study we focused on 6 institutions, and what we're focusing on is the difference that organizational culture and resources make. To frame the analysis, we use William Tierney's organizational culture framework, which suggests that you can think about culture in 6 ways. You can look at the environment, mission, socialization, information, strategy, and leadership. So the environment really is, how do people describe it? Is it friendly? Is it supportive? Is it hostile? How do you feel being there? The mission is not a university's mission statement, but it's a sense, it's what everybody feels their institution's purpose is. Is it to prepare, the top scholars and the top future practitioners? Is it to provide a sense of upward mobility? And everybody, what I think is critical here is it's everybody at the institution comes together to co-construct that mission. Socialization is really, how do the people there think about and internalize institutional values and expectations? Information, we think a little bit about what knowledge is valued, but more importantly, who creates it, who possesses it, and who shares it. Strategy, we think through institutional decision-making. What are we keeping in mind as we pursue goals? Is it bringing along everybody, or is it focusing on a particular percentage of the population? And then leadership doesn't just focus on who your formal leaders are, but informal leaders, right? Who is acting to move the mission forward, and in what ways? But it does also relate to, what do we expect of our formal leaders? Do we expect them to be supporting us? Do we expect ourselves to be left on our own? So for both studies, actually, we use Bartlett and Vavris's comparative case study approach, which expands typical definitions of case study to look at data across 3 axes, which are horizontal, vertical, and transversal. So the horizontal axis typically compares data across sites. And in this case, right, we were doing 6 institutions, so we were comparing across the 6. Vertical looks at the impact of policy on students' experiences. And transversal typically looks at changes across time. Bartlett and Vavris say that to do a comparative case study approach, you don't always need to use all 3 axes. And so in this study in particular, we focus more on the horizontal and the vertical. We selected these institutions. The 3 2-year institutions at the time were piloting an innovative study to support student parents. So it varied dependent on which institution or what they did, but they basically got $1 million in funding that they could spend down. I believe it was 1 million. But so they could spend down this money, and some of them chose to filter the money to individual student parents. So one institution built a student parent center that has now outlived this defunct grant. And then we paired it with 3 nearby 4-year institutions. So if one institution was if the 2-year institution was in one city, the 4-year institution was a site of transfer for these students. And before I go farther, I want to acknowledge the generous funding from the Jewish Foundation for Education of Women that made this study possible. You'll see in the study, we conducted interviews with 121 students, faculty, and staff. There were 82 student mothers and 39 staff members. And you'll see that we talked with more at the 2-year institutions, both students and staff. And I provided you with the demographics of the student mothers. It was a relatively diverse sample. The 35 identified as white, 17 identified as Hispanic or Latina, 16 were Black or African American. 5 were Asian or Pacific Islander, and a handful, which is hidden under something on my screen, were biracial and multiracial. And you can also see the relationship status. So we had married mothers, single mothers, those in a relationship, some who were widowed. And these things all shape the way that they move through the institutions. Because this is an academic talk, I'll talk a little bit about how we analyzed our data. I use Atlas TI, and we engaged in both concept and data-driven coding. Some of the sample codes included the faculty were supportive, on-campus childcare, and staff having a sense of responsibility. To analyze the data, we divided it into different families. So we looked at sort of commonalities across staff at 2-year institutions, students at 2-year institutions, and the same for 4-year institutions. So here's what we found. So 2-year institutions are community colleges, right? And everybody there talked about it was just part of the mission. Community colleges really are open access institutions. And until recently, many of them were free to attend. And they're still very, very low cost. So with these institutions, student parents were really prioritized. There was accessible on-campus childcare. There were these pilot programs that I talked about for supporting student mothers. And there were even family study rooms. And this mom said, they have like anything and everything that you need. And that it's with no judgment. So they're very open to people, and they seem to really care about their students. They're like, I want to help you. I want to see you succeed. I want to be there for you. I want to push you up and not bring you down. For their part, faculty, staff, and students noted the important role that childcare centers played on campus. What I thought was particularly interesting is that pre-COVID-19, all 3 campuses primarily serve student parents. But during the pandemic, a lot of the student parents pulled their kids out because the childcare center shut down. And so the 3rd had really shifted more to faculty and staff. But what's very critical, and this will come up a bit later too, is that the childcare center staff played such important roles for helping student parents navigate higher ed. It wasn't just the fact that there was free or reduced cost childcare, it was that these mothers tended to see the staff members as really important. One staff member on campus talked about that the childcare center director was, quote, responsible for more women with an associate's degree in the region than anyone else. And she really took it upon herself, this director. She would connect students to resources. She would get their children gifts, organize holiday drives around Christmas. She would bring in clothes for the children. She was the person who got them through. But yeah, I don't want to paint this as the community colleges are doing an excellent job. They're doing a great job. But what we found is that the staff members often fail to advertise the programs. One of the student parent support programs chose not to disseminate information about the program to conserve resources. And you can see here these lists of quote that many student parents did not know that childcare was offered on site, which was heartbreaking because often it was so reduced cost, which would have made a difference for many, many women and parents of all genders. For their part, though, community college academic and administrative staff were really committed to supporting student parents. They felt like it was part of the mission. And students felt the same, right? So the staff director of the student parents program said, we're really trying to establish an investment in these students financially and academically. A very explicit part of our program is to help them feel empowered and seen and respected. So I think we're doing those things and giving them a sense that they have a home base. Like, it all sounds so affirming and warm. And for their part, student parents really did feel affirmed and supported on these campuses. So keep that picture in mind as we go to the drastic wasteland of four-year universities. There really were few programs at the three institutions we studied that existed to support student parents. Instead, the language that got used by staff was that their mission was to support all students and to not provide programs at all to serve a small population. Childcare centers were unaffordable and inaccessible, and unused by student parents. So, and it's been a shift. On one campus, one staff member said that 15 years ago, 30% of the 70 children were those of student parents. But when we conducted the interview, only 3 were. So it really shifts the kinds of support that are being provided. And so although there were not system-wide policies, university-wide policies to support student mothers, we saw pockets of resistance on each campus. On one campus, the head of the non-traditional student programs, they called it there, seemed to single-handedly support student parents. She was the person that everybody on campus, when we reached out for an interview, they said, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. She's the one who deals with students with kids, as if nobody else had anything else to contribute. On another campus, it was the coordinator of the institution's distance learning program who became the advocate for student parents, simply because a large number of their students took courses online only. Faculty, who were parents themselves, extended support to student mothers in other informal ways. But overall, staff and faculty really displayed a lack of awareness of student mothers' presence. And for their part, student mothers didn't expect support from the institution, nor did staff plan to provide it. So it worked out well, right? One vice president for student affairs or student services, they said, on a college campus, can't be everything to everybody. So there's a balance that we have to strike there to either attract more students who are moms, or once they're here, whatever their needs are, how do we balance that effectively? So is this talk about conservation of resources and who is deserving of support? So to bring this back to the framework that we started with, in terms of, you can think through Tierney's framework of culture. Obviously, the environment on each campus is quite different. Two-year institutions fostered student parent-friendly spaces, on-site childcare and support programs, and four-year institutions were just unwelcoming to student parents' identities, of their parenting identities. The mission at two-year institutions, faculty and staff really believe they must attend to the whole student. And four-year institutions, faculty and staff believe they must serve all students. And so we're going to provide a sort of a blanket policy that people are going to need to fit into. At two-year institutions, the faculty and staff and students conveyed and affirmed the value of the parenting identity. Whereas at four-year institutions, it was very much that they felt that parenting was an individual undertaking. For their part, as I brought up, two-year institutional actors either intentionally or unintentionally failed to communicate supports for student parents. But at four-year institutions, there was just no information to pass along. Two-year institutions had an adaptive approach to strategy where they intentionally adjusted their support structures to try and meet the needs of student parents, while four-year institutions used an informal and disjointed strategy. Finally, at two-year institutions, there were both formal and informal champions for student mothers, and four-year institutions had few to no leaders centering student parents. What we found here, and I haven't talked about, is that students sometimes filled the gap from institutional or positional leaders. At some four-year institutions, student parents formed clubs to advocate for themselves. So, that's the comparative study of these 6 institutions. I want to spend a little bit of time sharing details with you from my other national study. And this is one that's already been published. You can see the citation below. It's titled From Comprehensive Services to No Support at All, and the role of campus services in supporting student mother success. Or I guess the article title is How Institutional Agents Shapes Student Mothers' Academic Success. Things change all the time. So keeping in mind the guiding literature that I talked about before, the only other things I really want to remind you about are different kinds of resources that might address the needs of student parents. So some campuses, let's think about those affirming 2-year institutions that I talked about, though here we'll hear about some affirming 4-year institutions. They offer priority class registration for student parents, so they can register for classes they need before anybody else. They also offer, again, accessible spaces where children are welcome and they're not told that they need to leave, and affordable childcare. Some federal and state programs exist. I already shared with you C Campus for a cheap, free or reduced childcare. TRIO and EOP are federally mandated programs that provide support for first-generation college students, university students, and they will often provide comprehensive support. KEYS is a program based out of Pennsylvania, and the acronym, what it stands for, escapes me right now, but it operates out of 2-year institutions, and some of the women who are in the study I'm about to tell you about were in it. And they got comprehensive advising. They were tapped into our welfare system, which is where you get benefits, food benefits, other kinds of benefits. And they also got money for childcare. And CalWorks is the same thing, and based out of California. What I'm going to focus on here, whereas in the previous study, I talked with you broadly about institutional agents and campus culture. Here, I'm honing in on the role that a relationship with a staff member can make. Remember that director I told you about, the child care center director? That's who we're going to think about here, because when the literature says when students have a strong connection with a staff member, you could be an academic, could be an administrative staff, it helps to increase their sense of belonging, and it helps them better navigate resources. So to help us with this study, we drew upon Ricardo Stanton Salazar's social capital framework, and he is built off of the work of Coleman and Bourdieu, and focused in particular on institutional agents, who he defined as key non-familial actors, usually based in a formal setting, who are critical in helping students activate institutional resources and thereby gain social capital. And you can see from his very fancy map that he identified 4 different kinds of support that institutional agents might provide. So they might provide direct support, which is when they can provide knowledge or resources, like somebody who provides funding. That's an example of direct support. Integrative support is helping students understand the cultural norms that they've walked into. Stanton Salazar developed this work out of working with Latino students in primary and secondary schools. And so it was often helping them articulate the unspoken cultural norms that might go counter to their upbringing. A system developer is one in which there's a comprehensive system where a student is embedded in a system with agents and resources and opportunities. So the single parent support programs that were piloted at those 3 2-year institutions in the previous study is an example. Agents working for those as a system developer, because students had access to money to pay for childcare. They had access to academic advising and to people who would help them. And then system linkages and networking support helps direct students to particular resources. You can see somebody might work as a bridging agent, right? If I go to my advisor and I need childcare support, they would help me access that through another person. So we use this framework to understand what students experience. This study, it was a national longitudinal study of 57 undergraduate student mothers enrolled at 2-year and 4-year institutions across the United States. As I shared earlier, it also used the comparative case study approach. So here we do talk about all 3 axes. They were recruited from 39 institutions. And as I mentioned earlier, the study was funded by the Spencer Foundation. In order to be eligible to participate in the study, all of the students were low income. They had to self-identify as low income domestic undergraduate student mothers who were eligible for the federal Pell Grant. And you can see here that it's a need-based grant that in the 22-23 academic year provided a maximum of nearly $7,000 in grant aid, need-based aid. To give you a sense, though, that is not enough to cover the cost of university in most places, and it particularly does not cover the cost of living expenses. We conducted interviews with 57 student mothers across the sample. 28 of them were at 2-year institutions at interview 1, and 29 were at 4-year institutions. And you can see that the breakdown was about 50% of them were white, which is a little less diverse than the national sample would suggest. And you can see the demographics of other participants as well. As I said, so our first round, we did 57 interviews, and then we followed up with participants and interviewed them again about 6 months later, and 42 of the original 57 agreed to participate. And then another 6 months later, we reached out again, and 35 of the 57 agreed to participate. But it's important to know that we had some people who participated in interview 2 and not interview 3, and there are some people who didn't participate in interview 2, but in interview 3. So it varies in terms of the numbers we spoke to. They were all semi-structured via Zoom, and they typically lasted about 60 to 90 minutes. And then at interviews 1 and 3, we also did a survey. We asked them to fill out the kinds of aid and assistance they received. So it was both financial aid sources, like the grant, the Pell Grant I mentioned, and how much they get, because it's determined by income, what kind of loans they took out, what kinds of credit card debt they had, what kinds of federal and state benefits they got, like food aid. Again, we coded data in Atlas TI. I'm happy to talk more about this, but for this study, we used Stanton Salazar's social capital framework. So before we went in and coded data, we agreed that we would use this framework and divided it. We had codes along direct support and the different kinds of support folks might provide. So across the institutions, we did identify some students, 14, who were at institutions that really didn't acknowledge them. Some of them were very much like the three institutions in the previous study, but some of them honestly were far more dire. They might have attended small, elite liberal arts colleges, or just small, non-elite liberal arts colleges, which tend to, they're private institutions, but they're highly tuition driven. So they might have tuition that costs $30,000 a year, for example. And they just don't attract and support students with kids. So, you know what, this mother in particular talked about that there was nothing there for her, and she kept fighting. And she says, I'm fighting and fighting for that spot at the childcare center, and gets tiring as a student. But I know that I'm not the majority of students at all, but it does impact like stressing about school. Because there simply was no one there to help her. But a slightly more positive news, we did have 22 of the students who we classified as being on a campus towards where there was at least one institutional agent who would help. It typically was noted to be the C campus coordinator, who was the person who managed this federally funded program to provide cheap financial aid or cheap childcare. And so, but it wasn't just the fact that they were providing childcare. It was the fact that these people were sharing information and guidance to the students. So Luna talks about that. She says, I was at failing grade at one point, and the C campus coordinator reached out to me. And then she reached out to my professor, and we worked on a game plan, because I think otherwise I would have just taken this terrible grade. But she was like, no, you can't do this. You'll lose your funding, because losing 40% is a lot for 3 kids in daycare. So you're receiving the receipt of C campus is determined based on your GPA. So if you're failing your classes, you lose the financial support. And Luna was not the only other student who talked about the really important role that these staff members played in helping them navigate things. Before I talk about this comprehensive support, another student actually had a mental breakdown in the last week of the semester. And she reached out to the coordinator of her program, and the coordinator contacted the professors for her and helped her work out a way to get incompletes and to or finish the semester successfully. And she said that she would have dropped out otherwise. We identified 21 students as receiving comprehensive support when they were on campuses where they had multiple resources to draw on their success. So it might be access to on-campus housing for student parents. It might be a campus grant. It might be a student parent center, which is usually staffed by a professional staff member. Victoria said, these programs make me feel like home, and also just like they see me and value me. Other participants were actually enmeshed in programs that were designed specifically for student parents, right? So Victoria was enmeshed in a series of programs. Some students were on campus in student parent specific programs. Staff members would connect participants to social service benefits. They would liaise with faculty and other campus offices. In particular, Kelly talks about the role that the student parent coordinator played to help her navigate these state programs to get food aid and utility aid. That she says, these programs that help pay my rent, helps give me heat and grocery assistance for the month. Getting onto those programs was an absolute nightmare. Like, talk about a lifetime supply of just paperwork and headaches. She was such a great support. She was behind the scenes calling the state and being like, what's going on with her paperwork? So I had an advocate in my corner. It was these actions from these people that kept these women enrolled. So I hope that it's clear from that brief overview that institutional agents really do play critical roles in facilitating student success. Participants in the no support group had access to few supports, while those in the limited group could draw upon institutional agents that they typically provided direct support. Right here is financial resources, but occasionally system linkages and networking support. While those in the participants in the comprehensive group really drew upon nearly all kinds of support, direct support, system linkages, and most critically, system development. So I want to wrap up my time with sharing a little bit about different examples of student parent supports that exist in the US. Not on every campus, but there's sort of, one of my doctoral students talks about freedom dreaming, right? About what can we do to be at a university that is truly student parent caregiver supportive. So some might provide student parent drop-in spaces. So it's a space where student parents can come with their children and study. When these institutions, and I've been trying so desperately to find a space on my own campus to do this, where they typically have a study room for parents and then a playroom connected for kids. These often will end up becoming a hub for student parents on campus. Student parent centers can also become a hub, but these are typically staff centers where staff members helping connect student parents to resources. On-campus childcare is so critical, and it's what we often tout in the US as being the answer and the solution. And it is, but it needs to be affordable. And student parents also talk a lot about needing it to be not just during the class hours, having extended hours in the evenings, especially as a lot of US universities offer classes now in the evenings, or weekend hours or drop-in hours. Figuring out ways to support student parents around their caregiving needs makes the difference. Should go without saying that campuses need to advertise what they do have. Even on my own campus, students don't know about what exists. And I will say on my own campus, it's quite minimal. But finding ways to advertise regularly and in ways that students will access the information. Family housing is something that US universities used to offer more of, but it's declining in its availability. On my own campus, there was a family housing where students could live with their children, but because the cost of on-campus housing is so prohibitive, often student parents are having to find other places to live. So thinking about how to make that affordable. Smaller things to think about are offering for campuses, as many in the US they're very commuter campuses, so people who drive to campus, having preferred parking for student parents. How can you make it easy for them to get to class and to leave? Or transportation assistance. At the US, we often give metro passes, subway passes, bus passes. During the height of the pandemic, when petrol prices were skyrocketing in some places, some universities in California in particular were giving out gift cards for student parents to sort of offset the cost of gas. I will say that it's a lot cheaper in the US, even and it's most expensive than it is in the UK. Priority registration for classes, as I've mentioned earlier, create opportunities for student parents to get into their classes. Because often it's such a tight calculus, right, to plan around other responsibilities. So if I don't get that 9 a.m. class, it will make a difference. Putting statements on our syllabi in support of caregivers. I have one on mine, and it both serves as a message to student parents that they're valued and their parenting is valued. Universities need to know who attends their campuses. My institution does not collect the identity of student parents. We don't know how many student parents. And in fact, when I tried to collect data on my campus about 5 years ago, my campus, for context, has 30,000 students. I was told there were 100 student parents on the campus. Now, given what I've shared with you about the numbers of, that 1 in 4 undergraduates is a student parent and 1 in 3 graduate students, I can tell you that number is incorrect. So how can we know if we're serving them if we do not know that who is there? And then at the very bottom of this list, I put a student parent club, right, or a union, because I actually don't think it should be on students to organize for themselves. When we frame it as such, we're saying that the onus needs to be on students to advocate for themselves. And really, it's an institutional responsibility. So I think they can provide support for one another, but I think it's up to our institutions to create environments that really where staff members are all working toward a shared mission to support the whole student and not just to support all students.